Okay, so we're going to be covering variables today. And so you're probably thinking, oh, I know all about variables. Well, that's great. Variables are fairly basic, but there's still quite a lot of stuff that we can look at that's going to make us a better programmer, that's going to be sort of making us not a beginner, but sort of step up to being a better, more intermediate programmer. So that's what we're doing today, variables. I'll just write it on here. Variables. Okay, so the first thing that we need to think about is, obviously we've got our 4 basic data types for a variable. So you should know this already. Again, this is not for a complete beginner. This is for someone who knows a little bit of Python, maybe just done a little bit, few hours, and done the basics. We've got 4 basic data types. Our integer, so I'm not going to go through that too much, but just we've got an integer, we've got a float, which is a number with a decimal place, we've got a string, and then we've also got a Boolean. So I'm going to assume that you know what those 4 things are, but just keep them in mind, because obviously we're going to be using a lot of different variables in this. Now let's think about, first of all, naming our variables. And if you've done any of my GCSE lessons, or even sort of Key Stage 3 for anyone watching the replay for this, you'll know that it's very important, and the exam boards in the GCSE or IGCSE always go on about naming your variables correctly and having meaningful names. And so I'm just going to kind of reiterate this as we go through a number of different conventions, but it is really important. We'll dive into it a little bit more, actually, about why that is important, and we'll look at some examples. But first of all, let's look at some different types of naming conventions. So when we create our variables, there's sort of a naming conventions that you can use. If you go out into sort of the internet as a whole, you can see that there's lots of different ways that people name their variables. And actually, if you work for a company, the company might sort of say, well, I want you to use this naming convention, and you might not agree with it, but you have to follow what they want you to do. Because if you've got teams of programmers working, it's really important that they have consistent code, because usually what happens is you end up amending someone else's code in that team, and you're not sort of working in isolation. So it is really important. So what is really popular with Python, or what the best way to use or naming conventions in Python, is to use something called snake case. So snake case is a naming convention, very popular, and all it does is you use an underscore if you've got 2 words effectively. So you'll use all lowercase, and then you have underscores to separate it. So let's look at some examples. And again, code this along with me so that you can, practice and keep this code as well. So I'm just going to do a few. So we could have username, but it's user underscore name, all lowercase. And we can just put Alice. Total score. Total underspace score, I don't know, 34. Max attempts, 3. Is logged in, equals true. So there's a few. I haven't done a float type, but you get the idea. So everything's lowercase. We use underscores if there's a different word. Now, there is a naming convention that I kind of have a bit of a hangover. So if you've done some of my lessons, I think most of you are here from my lessons. There is something called camel case. Camel case is not something that Python users tend to use. You shouldn't. It's used in Java, so mainly Java and JavaScript. And anybody who's kind of really into Python says don't use it. So try not to use it. Try not to use camel case. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So it would be user, no space, and then you use a capital letter, and then you would put Alice like this. So if you can see the difference there, the Python way of doing it is the underscore, the Java way using camel case, and you're just starting with a lowercase for the variable and then an uppercase if there's a new word within that variable. So there is also something called Pascal case. And Pascal case, we do actually use Pascal case. And Pascal, I can't remember whether it's one or, I think it's 2 words. Anyway, actually I'll do it like this. I'll put camel case like that. And there's Pascal case, which is using an uppercase letter for each one. This is actually what the Cambridge IGCSE that I teach. This one is actually used in Cambridge pseudocode. So Cambridge pseudocode use Pascal case. And ultimately what we're doing is we're using, so don't, again, only use this in classes. Now, if you don't know what a class is, don't worry. If you do eventually know what a class is, then you can, yeah, catch up with it. Okay. But Pascal case is uppercase letter, and just like this, we use capital letter to start with and a capital letter in the middle. So I know that you're probably thinking, oh, this is a bit petty. You know, like, does it really matter? Well, not if you're writing your own code or you're in an exam. It's really, you know, for even up to A-level, they really won't care which one you use. But if you want to try and make yourself a better Python programmer and look more professional, then you need to stick to what the convention is. And, you know, yeah, it's entirely up to you, but this is what is the best way to do it. And generally speaking, you know, I find, I mean, I use camel case a lot because I was a Java programmer and I was a C++ programmer before I did Python, and they both use camel case. So it's really hard for me to kind of shake that off. And having to write underscores. I mean, it's not, you know, having really long variable names like is logged in and you think, oh, it's a bit long, you know, or max attempts. But, you know, most of the time now, our IDEs, so Visual Studio or whatever, will, even this one, will auto sort of prompt you to say, I think you mean this variable, and you can get it to what's called autocomplete. Now, the next thing that we're going to look at is constants. So actually, that's all runs okay. So technically I should have said variables. We're looking at variables and constants today. A constant is just like a variable, but once that program is running and you hit run, you cannot change the value. So for example, if I created a constant called username and it was Alice, well, I couldn't change that username once the program is running. And the only way I could change it would be if I stopped the code from running, I changed the source code, and then I started running it again. And for a lot of things, this is not a viable option. You know, you can't do that. Now, Python doesn't technically have constants. Most programming languages do. In fact, I was looking at another one called Go, and that's becoming quite popular. And they have constants by default. And then you have to say, actually, no, it's not a constant, it's a variable. So it's the complete opposite to Python. But we can mimic constants in Python. I won't go into how you declare constants in other languages, but for example, Java, JavaScript, both have constants. C++ has constants. So, you know, lots of other languages do. So, but in Python, what we do when we have a constant is we just put it in uppercase. So constants, so values that don't change once the program is running. And we need to put them in uppercase when we're naming them. And this is even actually in languages like Java that do have constants, you still put them uppercase, even though you're saying this is a constant. And it's just a general naming convention that lots and lots of people use across the board. So for example, we could have pi, which is, it's auto-completed it for me, 3.142. We could have max login attempts. So we're still using the underscore though. Attempts 3, and we could have screen width I can't type today. I can't type any day. Equals 500, for example. So it's uppercase and underscore, so just like we're using for our snake case, but everything is uppercase. So again, this is going to highlight to people, if they're reading your code, if you have a constant, then you know it's all uppercase, and yeah, you know what you're doing. It's all about making sure you know what you're doing, to make it look like you know what you're doing. Now, I just want to sort of point out as well, you know, like I said, some of these are quite long. Max login attempts is quite long, but it is good to try and use a really descriptive name. So it might seem a bit cumbersome, especially if you're writing the code. But like I said, if I start typing and say, I'm going to do, don't copy this by the way, but I'm just going to do if A is greater than, and I start typing max login attempts, I've typed the M, I don't actually have to type it. You don't have to type it each time. You can just press, oh, there you go, that's the one I want, and it will auto-complete. So most IDEs will do that for you. So it is better to try and have a descriptive variable constant name. I mean, obviously, try not to have it like going across the screen. So, you know, if you have it like, you know, going across all like this, and that's your variable name, yeah, probably that's not good because it's taking up too much room. But this sort of thing is fine. You can though, so a lot of the time you can use single variable like X or Y or I or, you know, P or whatever you want to use. You can do that, but the best time to use those is if they're what's called a local variable and you're just using it for a short period of time. So for example, a for loop. So short variable names are okay in certain circumstances. So short variable names can be used, but only in short-term use. I'll show you a couple of examples of this. The first one might be a for loop. So we're just going to do for I in range 10, and we're just going to print I. So if you're using a for loop, absolutely go ahead, use a really short variable. Because once that for loop's finished, that variable gets destroyed in memory and we don't have to worry about it afterwards. So that's fine. That's one example. You have to decide whether it's short-term or long-term. You know, but yeah, for loop's a good one. Or maybe you're using one in a while loop. It could be, you know, X equals 0 while X is less than 100, print X equals X plus 1. So that's fine, it's temporary, it's a little loop that you're doing, and that's no problem. So just use your intuition, use your judgment when to use these. Another thing about naming variables, so I know I'm going on about this a lot, but it's really important, all of this basic stuff, is don't use reserved words. So, and what I mean by that is any kind of sort of in variable names. So don't use, for example, for, or don't use class, which is another one. Anything that's kind of purple. Don't use if. You'll see, I'll get an error. There we go. You'll get an error. So if you get that and you're like, hang on a minute, what's going on? If your variable name is not black in your code, or in this case it's black, but it could be whatever colour you've set it at, then you shouldn't use it. You know, the same thing. No, I'm just trying to think of other examples, like, yeah, like else. Again, it's in purple. Don't use it because it's a reserved word. Lots of rules there, but a couple of other summary things I'm just going to put here. I'm just going to comment those out, otherwise I'm just going to get errors the whole time. So the rules are, so far, just going to summarize. Rules in Python for naming, or for variable naming. So the first one is use snake case, or should I say use snake case underscore. The second one is use uppercase for constants. The third one is be descriptive. Because, you know, someone else will have to read your code probably, and then it might even be you 6 months later and you can't remember. Be consistent, so don't sort of consistent. Don't start using different naming conventions, and yeah. And then don't use reserved words. And then 6 is I haven't covered this one yet, but I'll do it in a moment. Make booleans read like questions. So this is a really good one. So with booleans, we do things like is logged in, yes or no. Or you could say has checked equals true, or has been checked. That's probably a better one. Has been checked. So have your booleans as a question. And it will make it just so much easier. Multiple assignments, so and creating multiple variables. So it's called multiple assignment. I'll just hide that code because we don't need it. Not anymore. So multiple assignment. Is it E? Oh, assignment. Yeah, there you go. No, it's no E. No E. Okay, so what we would normally do is do something like this. So I'm going to use short variable names at the moment, but it's only just to demonstrate. So we could have like x equals 1, y equals 2, z equals 3. Now they're all integers, aren't they? So that's fine. But what you can actually do instead of having it on a single line like this is you can put them on the same line. So we could instead do this. We do x, comma, y, comma, z equals 1, comma, 2, comma, 3. And what this does is it's just a really neat way of saying I've got these 3 variables, they're all the same. X is going to be 1, y is going to be 2, and z is going to be 3. Got my for loops running there and my while loop. So again, it kind of shows that you know a little bit more about Python, and instead of having on a separate line, you know that you can do it on the same line there. And you can do this with any variable type. So we could do, for example, we could do, I don't know, is okay, was checked, like that. I don't just do 2, and then we can just do true, comma, false, for example. And you can see that that works okay. So it doesn't matter what you're doing. I'm not sure. I've never used it where you can mix types, actually. Don't know. I've never actually tried it where you mix types. But I would just stick to the same one because it makes it clearer. So although Python might let you do kind of an integer and a Boolean, I would stick to the same data types. And just be careful that you have the same amount on each side. So obviously there's two variables here and there's two values on this side. So if you have sort of a third one here, then you're going to get an error. You can see I've got too many values to unpack. It's called unpacking as well. So obviously I only need to have two. So just make sure that you get that correct as well. So that's a nice little way to show that you know what you're doing in Python. Okay, so that's multiple assignment, really helpful. Yeah, what we can actually do though, we can also put in a what's called a type hint. Now, like I said before, some programming languages, they make you declare variables and you have to tell the program language what basic data type your variable is. In Python, it doesn't do that. It just, you know, if you create X here, you give it a value 1 so it knows it's an integer. This one here was checked, it's false, so you can say, okay, it's a Boolean, and it does it for you. But what you can actually do in Python is you can tell it in the code what data type it's going to be, which is very similar to other languages where you declare a variable. And this is very good as well if you're sort of have code that you know, you want to make it clear what this data type is. So it's called basic type hint. So again, you don't have to do this, but it's helpful if you want to make it clear. So we're going to create a variable called name, and we're going to say it's a string, and I'm going to give it the value Alice. I keep putting alive instead of Alice. So we've basically said colon and then the variable type, it's a string, and you know this is more, it's not so much for Python, it's for the person who has to maintain your code, which could be you. So we can do the same. We can say this is an int, age is int, and you could have a percentage or percent, and that's a float. And we can have a Boolean as well, but we say bool, not Boolean. Like that. So that's quite handy. You don't have to do it, but like I said, it is very helpful. This is especially helpful actually if you are writing a function or a procedure. We will cover functions and procedures and the best practice for that, but I could just do, it's really, really helpful for that. So I could say, you know, def, I'm going to create a function, def calc average, and I have the scores, and then I put colon, and it's integer, for example. You can also, if it's returning something, you can actually say it's returning, for example, a float. So again, you don't have to do this, but it is helpful. And we can just do return. I'll just put here some code. And then I'm just going to return 4.5. So it's just a completely made up function just to show you the naming conventions rather than anything else. So if I run that, you can see there's no error. Now, the last thing that we're going to look at is something called scope. Now, this is sort of bigger than the last sort of 5-10 minutes that we've got, but I'm going to cover it a little bit. We might go into it in more detail at a later date, but variable scope is really important. So variable scope is one of the most important things, actually. If you can get your head around variable scope, it's going to really help you become a much better programmer. And all variable scope is you're thinking about, where is my variable created? Where in code is the variable created? And where does it get destroyed? Now, this all goes back to the fact that when you create a variable, Python, when it interprets your code, will work out when that variable stops being used. I'm going to go onto the whiteboard. I did have a whiteboard here, just in case. So let's have a look at this with scope. So say, for example, this is our code. So this is our .py file. We've got lots of code in here, and we're going to run it. And really understanding scope, what you're thinking about is what's going on in the RAM when you create a variable. So for example, I've got the whole code here. I create a variable called x and I set it to 3. So Python goes to my RAM, creates a variable called x and sets it to 3. And this will probably be kept in the RAM for that entire time that the program is run, because it's in the main part of the code. I've declared it at the top, or in the main part of the code, it's going to keep it. Now, if I create a for loop, for example, so I put for I in range 10 and then print I, that variable I gets created here, doesn't get created before because this is the first time I'm using that I. It goes to the RAM, it creates I, and then it's set to, first of all, 0, then etc, etc. It goes up to 10, or actually goes up to 9 because it's using range. And then as soon as we get to this line here, which might be print hello world or something like this, whatever the next line of the code is after the for loop, so that's line 5, 6, that's line 7, this I here, because it's no longer used, we've finished it in the for loop, we're on line 7, it gets completely destroyed in the RAM. Just completely deleted because it's not needed anymore. And this is on purpose, because otherwise programs might create that I. So if it didn't destroy it, we've got that little variable I, and it's going up, or it's sat there and it's not being used. It's eating up your RAM. So it could happen that you've got this all over your program and you create another variable, and your RAM gets filled up really quickly. And it's called a memory leak, basically. So there's lots and lots of safeguards in programming languages to make sure that your RAM doesn't get clogged up by your bad programming. So let's just give these labels. This X here, this is known as a global variable because it's in the main part of the code and it's probably going to be used for the entire time. But it might be, it could be down here where we say this is the last line of code, line 10, and we put X equals 9, for example. And then once the program's finished, it will destroy that X from the RAM. So that's a global variable. It's used in the whole of the code, and that's why we use the word global. The good thing about programming is everything is usually named really well. Now this I, this is known as a local variable. And that local variable is just used in a very small part of the code, and then it gets deleted. So this is a concept that's really, really important, and it can get people, it can cause people a lot of bugs. It's not normally a syntax error bug. It would be the value isn't changing like I was expecting it to, or what's happened to my variable. It's saying my variable doesn't exist anymore, because if I tried down here to say I equals 4, well, I'm going to get an error, because if you create a variable within a for loop, then it's a local variable by default, and Python will say it doesn't exist anymore because I've deleted it. Now this also applies to functions. So if I had that function before, had a function, my function print hello, and I just give it a string, a value, and I just do print value. Again, value here, or actually, if I create a variable in here, if I create x equals 4, for example, let's just think about the x, and I do x equals 5. If you're running this function, I've got a variable here called x as a global variable, and I've got a variable x here, which is a local variable. So these are actually two different variables. So this one here, it will be 5. And this one's also called x, but it's local x, and this one is global x. So this is why using variable names and using descriptive names is really important, and understanding the difference between a global variable and a local variable is also really important. There is a lot more to this, but for now, just because we're doing a little bit of extra stuff, you know, global versus local is important, but you don't need to understand any more at this stage.